Sejam bem-vindos ao podcast Physio Frontiers. Essa é uma série especial do portal Fisiortopedia em parceria com a base de dados Pedro Brasil.
O objetivo desse podcast é contribuir para aproximar pesquisa e prática clínica em diferentes contextos, quebrando barreiras linguísticas e trazendo convidados internacionais que fazem a diferença na área.
Eu sou o Bruno Saragiotto.
E eu sou Tia Yamato.
E juntos nós iremos te guiar nessa jornada pelo mundo.
Prepare-se e
vem com a gente! Hello and welcome to another episode of the Physio Frontiers podcast. This is a partnership between the Physio and Orthopedia and the Physiotherapy Evidence Database Brazil. And today we are honored to have actually two guests. We have two Peters. We have Professor Peter O'Sullivan, professor at the School of Allied Health Science at Curtin University. And we also have Associate Professor Peter Kent, Associate Professor and Adjunct Academic Physiotherapist at Curtin and Macquarie Universities. They both have an amazing track record and an amazing clinical experience. So welcome, Peters. And for this episode, we'll be calling Peter Kent PK, Peter O'Sullivan Pete. Yeah, welcome.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, before we dive into your research and more about the CFT, we're going to learn about your careers a bit. Could you tell us about your journey? How did you decide to be a physiotherapist in first place, and then researchers? So I think I'll start with Pete and then PK.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in New Zealand, actually, and I was kind of not quite sure which direction I was going to go in terms of, like, young guy, had a few different ideas. I kind of really fell into physiotherapy. I didn't really know what it was. And pretty much at the end of my training, I trained in Dunedin at the bottom of New Zealand. And at the end of my training, I realized that there was almost no evidence for anything I'd been taught. That deeply unsettled me. We had this small library, and I think there was pretty much, I think they had the Australian Physiotherapy Journal, and we had, the journal Spine. And I remember going to the journals and reading this stuff and then going back and asking my lecturers all these questions that they couldn't answer because there was no evidence for what we've been taught. That really concerned me. And so I was really at a crossroads when I finished my training to go, do I want to do this job? Like, I feel like I've just learned a whole lot of stuff that has no evidence, and I'm just going to go out and do it. So I actually applied for medical school at the end of my training, and I went for an interview, and they said, we don't really know if we want you to just move straight from one training into another. And it's almost like you've just lurched from one thing to another. So I took a year, and I was really lucky in that year to work with some quite inspiring clinicians. And I was like, maybe there is something in this, even though there's not much evidence. So that kind of led me down a path, I think, in the first few years as a graduate of doing every workshop I could do in New Zealand. And I realized that I was treating people's symptoms, and I had really no idea of what the underlying mechanisms were. And that also deeply unsettled me. So I'm like, hit another crossroad of what do I do now? I ended up going to Perth, which is where I am now. And I did the master's program in manual therapy, which I really enjoyed. But again, when I came out of that program, I took a job in a private practice with Bob Elvey, who some people might know, amazing clinician. And I was working with people who are coming in with stiff necks and stiff backs, and I could use manual therapy, and it seemed to work, and the patients were happy. But I also worked in a pain clinic, and these people were completely different. These people came in with wheelchairs. They couldn't sit or stand. They were on piles of drugs. They were highly sensitized. None of my techniques that I'd learned as a manual therapist worked for these people. So I kind of had these completely contradictory experiences. And I realized that actually we had no evidence for what we did at that point. There were almost no randomized control trials back in the 90s. So I'm like, I'm either going to give up this job or I'm going to start doing some research. So that took me into a research career. And I suppose at that point, my understanding of pain was very mechanical, structural, signs and symptoms orientated. And I realized very quickly that and you see that from the early research that we did, which is very much into the stability model and thinking of
Yeah.
pain in the back is related to instability, really quickly realized with this massive increase in understanding of pain physiology and the pain behavior, the psychology of pain, that actually my kind of traditional understanding of pain just had to be updated. So essentially my career has been a painful reevaluation of all my own beliefs and clinical behaviors, I think, to realize that actually we have a huge opportunity as a profession to encompass a much broader understanding of pain, to be way more targeted and person-centered about delivering effective care to the things that, drive pain. And so my career has essentially been half-time as a clinician, 0.5 as a clinician, 0.5 as an academic, where I've worked in the clinic and I've gone back to the lab, and I've worked in the clinic and gone back to the lab. And it's been that process, I think, of evolution that's kind of led me to the point where we are now.
Great.
That's very interesting. Yeah. PK?
Well, there are parallels between Pete's journey and my journey, but there are also divergences. I also started out in a little town in New Zealand, and my parents went to a chiropractor. And so I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do either, but I thought I would do chiropractic. You couldn't do it in New Zealand, you had to come to Australia. So I came to Melbourne and I enjoyed the study. I was curious and I did some research during my undergraduate degree, but I also felt like it wasn't enough. There were so many unanswered questions. So I went straight out of chiropractic straight into physiotherapy. They didn't mind that I hadn't practiced. I went straight in. And I worked in a multidisciplinary clinic, and that was a great experience. And I was really focused on manual therapy. So when I finished, I worked as a physio. I worked in a rehab hospital for a couple of years, mostly with stroke and orthopedics and amputees. But I also worked part-time, and I was quite passionate about manual therapy. So I did the postgraduate MINIPS diploma. But I felt like there was stuff that I was missing. I was seeing, just normal ambulatory folk coming in, and often it would work, but also there were people, particularly with persistent pain, that I just felt like I was missing things. And I was particularly aware of the sort of psychosocial dimensions, people distressed, people out of work, people stuck in a pain role that I didn't seem to have the tools. And so I started thinking a lot about subgrouping back pain, thinking about, there's this big non-specific low back pain thing. Maybe if we're going to be able to determine what's the right treatment at the right time for the right person, maybe subgrouping is a way of understanding what works for whom. And so I did a PhD on subgrouping in low back pain, and particularly around subgrouping methodology. And then had an NHMRC postdoc, and during that time got approached by some folk in Denmark that were very interested in that and invited me, and I went over, and in the end I stayed for 7 years. And in that period, I think I reached the conclusion that subgrouping seemed to me to be useful at a kind of macro level, but there's this thing about identifying a particular cluster. Let's use the start back tool, for example. You look at a high risk group. The critical thing is aligning the treatment appropriately, if that's going to make a difference. And how do we do that? Well, it seemed to me that it was a lot about individualizing. So how do we individualize care? And it was during that period in Denmark that I met Pete, and CFT seemed to me an approach which was operationalizing that quite well. And not long after, I got invited to go to Curtin and spent 5 years there. So that's the sort of journey. I'm not a clinician anymore. During that period of doing the PhD, I had so much pain in my hands from doing manual therapy that it got to the point I couldn't practice anymore. And it was just serendipity. It was just luck that this research career that I had thought was a sideline kind of gave me a way to transition, and I've been a researcher ever since.
Oh, that's amazing. So you two have traveled around many different subjects of the year. For example, as you said, biomechanics and posture, exercise, but manual therapy, subgrouping, pain education, pain in kids, and more recently, cognitive functional therapy. So we'd like to know, how do you both see the evolution of the study of the pain field over the years? Like, do you think, are we getting better at treating pain? Are we understanding better how pain works? What's your feeling or opinion?
You go first.
Okay. It's like, look, I think we have a much deeper understanding of pain than when I graduated. Like there was almost nothing. I can remember talking to a colleague of mine when we were undergraduates to say, this is a new frontier. We know nothing about this subject. So there's been an explosion of knowledge around pain. I think what we haven't done well, and if you look at the guidelines, they're really clear about what best care should look like. But I think what we haven't done is we haven't taken the profession with it or upskilled clinicians to deliver it. So we go, do physiotherapists deliver guideline-based care? No, they don't a lot of the time. Why? Well, if we look at the qualitative studies, it's because they go, well, we haven't been skilled to do it. We don't know how to deal with people's distress. We're not confident to ask people about how they feel about their anxiety, emotions, their mood, what's happening in their life. What do we do if a patient breaks down and cries with us? What do we do if they had a panic attack? We haven't equipped people for that. I think we've been trapped in this old model of thinking that, this short time-based framework model of treating signs and symptoms, which we've been trapped in. And so, typically someone on the street, you say, what is a physiotherapist? And I have this all the time. People go, oh, you're a physio, give me a massage. Like, we've been trapped in this label where it's like we have this sense of expectation. If someone comes to us, we've got to treat them. Treatment looks like put them on a table, give them a rub or a push. So in a sense, we've created a corner, as I see it, we've created this kind of role model for ourselves we're stuck in with short consultation times. So there's sense of expectation, there's lack of skill. So I think we have broader understanding, but we fundamentally lack a clear pathway and skill set and confidence to deal with pain differently, to target the things that we know are really important to target with this patient group. So I kind of see we've learned so much, but there's been this massive lag where we haven't upskilled clinicians to confidently deal with really tough pain problems in an appropriate way. So that's a huge gap that we see that, we're trying to bridge, I suppose, in the work we do.
Great.
I think what I would add is, I think you can look at it from two lenses. You can look about what's been the development of understanding in the scientific community and the broader clinical community, and what's been the understanding in the physio domain, and have we applied it, which is partly what Pete was talking to. When I did manual therapy, which was in the late 90s, I remember a class with a rheumatologist, and he was bright and charismatic, and he was talking to the group, and he introduced a hypothetical of a particular patient coming in with chronic pain who'd had a lot of manual therapy, and he posed the question to the group saying, would you do more manual therapy? And some people said yes, and he said, well, why? And they said, well, they may not have done manual therapy the way that I do. Maybe they weren't particularly good at it. And I said, I don't think I would. And he said, why wouldn't you? And I said, well, maybe they need a different approach. And he said, well, why do you think that? And I said, well, what would I know? But it just seems to me that maybe we need to change direction if it hasn't worked before. And he said, well, I agree with you. And so it seems to me in some ways we've still been a bit stuck in the same way that, we have a toolbox and we use those tools to the best of our ability. But when it isn't working, we kind of run out of options. And when we look at an approach like CFT, in some ways it pushes our boundaries. It pushes our sense of professional self-identity. It pushes our sense of what we think our scope of practice is. But I think we have to be brave about evidence-based treatments which have demonstrated efficacy. We have to kind of say, are we willing to step up if that's what's good for patients? But I think another element of that is it's also what's good for us, in the sense that I do think, and maybe I was one of them, I do think that in many careers, clinicians who are physios reach a point where they feel kind of frustrated with, I can't change people in the way that I would like. Just doing the same thing isn't rewarding for me anymore. So what am I going to do? And I think we risk losing bright people, skilled people from the profession if we don't take the opportunity to stretch our professional boundaries and say, maybe we can do things in a different way in circumstances where that's appropriate and where we're appropriately trained and supported.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned a lot about the training as well. And we see that, for example, back pain, for example, is still the leading cause of years lived with disability for over 30 years. And I've been teaching physio students over the past 6 years, not a big career, but I've done that in Brazil and in Australia. And I feel the same gap in knowledge, which is communication. And I know that CFT use a lot of communication, and any modern pain education, any modern therapy with the behavior change, you need more communication skills. Do you agree with that? And during the CFT training that you've been doing for a few years now, do you feel that's the same challenge or for training clinicians, and that's maybe a way for looking for the future, for future interventions?
Yeah, so I think there are so many elements that you highlight there. If I kind of look at typical, historical training, I suppose, for physiotherapists, it's very much clinician-centered communication. It's like, where's your pain? Where are your signs and symptoms? Where's the impairment? I'm going to treat it. I'm going to tell you what to do. Where patient-centered care is the complete opposite. It's like, tell me your story. Let me explore, what's happening in your world. Let me explore your thoughts and emotions and fears and worries and expectations and your own perceptions of the world and what's happening in your social world and where are your obstacles for recovery and, where are the roadblocks? And then what are your behaviors around how do you respond to pain? What are your macro behaviors in terms of avoidance or re-engagement or your internal body responses, the way your body protects protects itself. Like there's so many elements around the individual to go, what is happening in your world? How can we help you make sense of that? Because often people are being told so much rubbish, like sit tall, lift brace your core, avoid stuff if you bend, the meaning of your pain means you're damaged. Like there's all this stuff out there that we often reinforce, without realizing it. That actually leaves people really stuck in this horrible cycle. And so unraveling all of that takes great communication skill because you have to build trust. One of the things that we know about the patient group that we had in the trial is that had a lot of intervention. They lose trust in clinicians. They've been promised stuff before. They've had stuff done to them. Very rarely have people taken a partnership approach and said, we're not going to fix you. We're going to walk with you. We're going to support you to empower you to self-care for yourself. Complete U-turn in what happens in a lot of primary care or secondary care for people with pain. So there's so many elements that are different, I think, than traditional care. Communication is definitely part of it, but also understanding human behavior and empowering people to take control of a situation that's really threatening and scary, and actually build a sense of autonomy and confidence to re-engage with life. That's a whole lot of stuff that comes together, which is really a broad skill set, I think, that's quite different than traditional training or education around managing pain.
Yeah.
And I'm not trained in CFT, so I can't talk from that perspective, but I can talk from my observation of people training and my observation of the feedback from patients who have been through CFT. It seems to me the communication bit is not just about good listening and coming to the encounter with an open and curious approach that's willing to go with the patient to where the patient needs to go. But it's also seems to me about when you're doing things with people, when you're doing behavioral experiments, when you're in very sensitive encounters, meaning that people are in pain and you're asking them to do things that they're fearful of, that it's about having a really fine sensitivity to reading people and reassuring people in a way that they know that they can trust you and you've got their back. So I think there's dimensions to that. And again, I say that from the position of someone who is not CFT trained.
You know, I think just leading on from what Peter said, the behavioral component that's in vivo, like we embody our pain, right? And so our body responses, the way we perceive our body, the way we use our body, the way we posture it and move it, seems to be fundamental. And this seems to be, I think, is often a gap that is not well addressed in care for people. And it's the one thing we consistently hear from patients as being one of the most profound learning opportunities is this idea of re-engaging in feared or avoided movement and doing it in a different way, of perceiving their body differently, understanding their pain differently, and realizing that actually it's safe to do things that they've been frightened of. That this kind of massive shift, cognitive shift and behavioral shift, they go together. It's like the body and mind are so interlinked, and breaking that kind of breaking that apart seems to be so central to this process that from what we understand from what the patients are telling us.
One patient recently told us on a video, he is a clinical psychologist. He was talking about this kind of central moment for him, this kind of epiphany that he had, which was he was working with a CFT trained clinician doing something that he was very fearful of. And he realized that a lot of stuff is kind of held in the body, a lot of emotional stuff, a lot of past trauma kind of stuff. And he said, as a psychologist, his thinking had been, if you change the mind, the body will follow. And what he realized is that there's a lot buried in the body, that when you kind of go into that space, it's kind of revealed, it's kind of present then. And so, as Pete was saying, there's this exquisite dance going on. It's, you know, it's not body, it's not mind, it's not Takata, it's about this holistic thing of people who are in pain, particularly persistent pain, bring a lot of stuff to the table. And physios in many ways are kind of uniquely placed to address that, because we have this social and legal license to work with people hands-on. We have time, and it's an opportunity for us.
Amazing. And just still about the CFT, maybe more directed to Pete. So can you tell us a little bit, like briefly, what is CFT? And I'm curious about the background story, like because your research group created the CFT, and then like, did you feel we needed something else? What we have available wasn't enough? Like, I just want to know like the background, like what was in your mind in the process.
Well, I'm a restless person, so and because I work with patients all the time, and I think because naturally I love working with people. It's something I deeply enjoy. So it's why I'm still a clinician. Like, I love going to work. I hear physios saying, "Oh, I hate my job and I'm burnt out. I don't like it." It really saddens me, because I have this joy of going to work, of working with people, and I see people who are, you know, highly disabled and highly distressed. That's my patient group that I work with. I love it. I think it's such a privilege to be someone who they trust, to kind of share their stories and to walk a journey with them. And I think having worked as a manual therapist, which I actually found deeply frustrating at times. Like, we can give people short-term pain relief and, reassure them and get them going. And that's totally cool. I have no problem with that. But this is for a different group. These are people who've done it, have tried it, who are, get a day's relief from manual therapy and they come back and the problem's there again. I felt a deep sense of like, I can't do this anymore. I can't justify bringing these people again and again for treating their symptoms like I'm giving them Panadol. So from a personal point of view, it's like there's something missing here. If you track my career both as a clinician, but probably more publicly is in the publication history, you'll see some of the earliest papers were around stabilization training for back pain and instability and stuff. So that was where my mindset was at the moment. And at that time, and we were looking at things quite unidimensionally around I think early on, I could see different human behaviors, like these different behavioral responses to pain. And we kind of saw them as different subgroups around movement. And I think what we realized from the research we're doing and also working with patients, these are just more behavioral manifestations of someone's individual response to pain. And that was often driven, I think we were thinking it from a biomechanical point of view, but actually these are often driven through cognitions and emotions and, social stresses and stuff that drive behaviors essentially where, it's like Peter said, it's complex. And so I suppose over my journey, we started going into we need to subgroup, a bit like Peter's story as well. And we realized subgrouping didn't really allow once you consider multiple dimensions, so if you consider someone's, pathoanatomical factors, their cognitive factors, their emotional factors, their social factors, their lifestyle factors, the physical behaviors, once you have that complexity, you can't subgroup. It's just such a mess. And for clinicians, they can't deal with that complexity. So we realized that we needed some kind of broader framework to say, actually, that all of these factors may be important for some people. They may be different for others. So some may be really in the lifestyle, physical, anatomical domain. For others, it may be strongly in the social domain, or others in the psychological, like the cognitive emotional domain. So we need a way of exploring those factors that sits within the examination, but also exploring behaviors that's in the physical examination, and then having some kind of multi-dimensional framework for a clinician to go, what are the dominant factors in this presentation? What are the things that we potentially can change? What are modifiable and what things aren't modifiable? Because we know there's stuff in people's lives you can't modify. You can't modify the fact that, you've got a case I saw yesterday. You might have someone, your partner's got Alzheimer's. They don't even recognize you. The distress that has on you as a person, I can't change that as a clinician. But people's behavioral response to that stress, you might be able to modify. And so the pain may be a manifestation of the person who's highly stressed and not sleeping and not engaging in physical activity, who's become socially isolated because of all this stuff that's happening in their world. How can I, as a clinician, support that? So that we don't pathologize pain. We don't teach people to, start protecting the body and, avoiding stuff, but we actually say, what, this is what it looks like is going on for you. So let's help you make sense of your pain. Let's build your confidence back in your body. Let's re-engage you with engaging in physical activity and get you socially integrated. And, that's the framing, I suppose, of CFT that looks to the individual, understands their unique profile of what's happening in their world, what their thoughts, emotions, behavioral responses, what's happening in their life, and say, how can we partner with you to optimize your situation, to build your confidence in your body, to get you back to living again? And that's different for everybody. And that's a deeply rewarding thing to do as a clinician. And I think it takes so much pressure off us as a clinician, because I can't fix his world, but I can support him to, he loves to ride a bike. So, let's keep you riding bike, keep you fit, keep you strong. Let's give you confidence, give you an understanding, give you strategies when you're in pain that you feel you have autonomy over that situation. that's the kind of lens that I suppose we've come to in understanding pain is multidimensional, it is complex. There are factors we can't change. And so, people are going, oh, well, your effect sizes are small, but shit, we're dealing with a really complex problem. We're actually, there are no fixes out there, but can we do better to reduce the burden of disability that goes with pain? That's where the big challenge is in my mind, because that's where it really is so terribly destructive for both the individual and society.
And also there are no large effects over there.
So if you can get if you could, and
other
to be fair on that, if you look at the median, the average effect, there are some people where you see really large effects, and there are others where there aren't. And so we need to know better about who we can really help, and we need to know better about who we are struggling to help, and that may mean you need multi-disc care. But I think as Peter will talk later, often the people who need the care don't get the care. The people who probably don't need the care get too much care and the wrong kind of care. And so we've got a bit of a mess in our society as well, and our health systems, where we give we fund the wrong kind of care to the wrong people. So it's cheaper to get a $50,000 spinal fusion for a highly distressed human being who probably is not going to do very well from it than it is to get $1,000 of treatment, over a course of a period, to empower people to understand what's going on, build their confidence in their body to get back to living. That's crazy.
And just to talk to effect sizes, we say, in this population, it's hard to make a difference. And that's true. But in the Restore trial, people came in with a mean Roland Morris disability score of around 12.5. And at the end of 3 months, they had about half that. And that halving of their disability stayed all the way through to the end of the observation period. And we've got a 3-year follow-up, which will be done in about 10 weeks. And we're interested to know, how enduring was that, given the ups and downs of people's life over time. But to halve someone's disability, if we put that in terms of a minimal clinically important change of 5 points on a Roland Morris disability score, in the usual care group, 19% had a change of 5 RMDQ points or more. In the CFT groups, it was 80%. So, these are substantial differences in a really difficult population for not just RMDQ, but everything changed and everything endured. So it looks like something shifted.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're gonna turn our attention to the Restore trial. I still have one question for Pete, but I can do later as we started to talk about Restore. Just don't want to forget it. But could you probably you, Piki, if you want to start, could you provide us a brief overview of the trial and the primary aims or something like that?
Sure. So the trial was a 3 group parallel randomized control trial. There were 3 groups. One was usual care, so people were able to access or seek whatever care they were doing. We didn't interfere with that in any way, and we didn't try to control for the number of treatments or the intensity of treatments relative to the other group. We're just saying, so if we take this group and we split them up and we add something, what's the effect of that? So there were 2 other groups. They both had cognitive functional therapy, and they both wore wearable wireless sensors during the consultation and home after the consultation. And there were up to 8 consultations, 7 in the treatment period of 3 months, plus a follow-up at 6 months. Now, the difference between the CFT groups was, although they both wore wearable wireless sensors, in the CFT-only group, the output of those sensors was completely hidden from both the patient and the clinician. So it was just there as a placebo for the wearing of the sensors. In the biofeedback group, CFT plus biofeedback group, the difference was that information was visible to both the patient and the clinician, and also the clinician could set individualized biofeedback to remind people to do or not do things when they were home as a reinforcement of behavioral change. So the patient group were people who had persistent low back pain. I talked about their disability. On average, the cohort that was recruited had 6 out of 10 of an average pain over the previous 2 weeks. And the median duration was 4 years. And we trained 18 physiotherapists who had minimal exposure to CFT. We were very interested if we just take a bunch of people that are interested in learning this and we train them to competency, what would be the effects of that? So none of the trial team were involved in treating patients, just the 18 physios that we trained. We trained 9 in Sydney and 9 in Perth. So there were 2 sites for the trial, and in each city there were multiple centres. So there were 18 physios with 20 clinics that were involved. So some physios worked across multiple clinics. In terms of the primary clinical outcome, it was pain-related physical activity limitation, or disability for short. There were a number of other secondary outcomes, but there was also an economic side. So we were looking at the economic efficiency, and the primary outcome there was a measure of quality of life, the Euroqual.
That's a very well-designed study in a high-impact journal. I think we can maybe confidently say that this is the best CFT evidence we have now. And results are mostly positive, which is good news as well. But just changing for the intervention and the training, because as I work a lot of implementation, research, telehealth, I keep thinking about the training. I met Mark Hancock a few times, and I remember he was saying, we are doing this amazing trial, and the training is, and telling me about the training. I don't have a CFT training, but I know it's a very complex intervention, complex training, and very intense training, even by the description of the trial. 8 hours training, took us 5-6 months. And then I keep thinking, like, how can we make the CFT something implementable and scalable for public health or more globally? Have you ever thought about that? I have discussions about that.
Can you imagine us not thinking about that?
No.
I wake up at night thinking about that. So if you think about, like, I trained as a manual therapist, Peter trained as a manual therapist. How many hours did that take?
Yes.
How many hours do you reckon it trains to train as a manual therapist?
Well, there was training in the undergrad, but then there was a year full-time training.
Massive. And the hours we practiced, I remember hundreds of hours of practicing to manipulate the cervical spine. Hundreds, literally hundreds. So I have a real problem with this. Oh, it's too big, it's too hard, it's too many hours. Like, we've got a spinal surgeon who does a fusion. How many hours does it take to train that person to do a spinal fusion so the person doesn't die on the table? Hundreds of hours. So I think we could look at it 2 ways. We can go, this is a lot of training and it's really intense and it's not realistic. Or we go, hang on a second, maybe we got to change how we prioritize our training. So if you're spending, God knows, hundreds of hours to do manual therapy, and I'm a manual therapist, so it's like I've done it. I've spent those hours, but shit, if there was you talk about one thing in my career, if I'd learned, I tell people about, hands-on skills, great. I think it imparts something, confidence, and, it gives you, it's a form of communication. It's great. But if I could have rediverted my skills around a broad understanding of communication skills, a broader set of skills, that's where I would put my energy now. So it's not a small amount, but we're dealing with a group of people who we know don't get better. Like, we know we're failing in our care system. So it's not going to be a weekend workshop. And what we've learned in our training, in our studies, is you can't learn this in a weekend workshop. You need knowledge, you need skills, and then you need to develop specific competencies to deal with really tough cases. So, you know, we realize that there's a, you know, we have a responsibility around dissemination, but we think broadly that we need to change how we think about. I think physios often get trained in techniques, so we get supervised techniques. We don't get trained in communication skills and around how to manage complex cases and how to, you know, clinical reasoning. Like, where is the research out there in clinical reasoning? We've just got Ian Cowell's just about got a paper that will be hopefully accepted, but there's nothing out there. So we have a complex problem, and there's nothing out there about how a clinician takes complexity and reasons with it to help prioritize care. So there are so many gaps, as I see it, in the way we've trained people. We need to fill those gaps early in training. We need to probably change how we do our postgraduate training. We need to have a different way of assessing the competency, I think. So look, you know, to me, it's a really important question. It's something we have clearly thought a lot about, but we think we need a system level change to bring these things earlier into training, so it's not like such a shock. Because what we found in the qualitative journey of the physios is like I was having to change the way we thought about stuff. So that shouldn't be the way it is for people to do more advanced training. It would be like a natural stepping stone in my mind.
I also think it reflects an evolution in the way that we train physiotherapists. I'm of retirement age, and when I was training, it was very much a biomedical model, but it was also an acute care model. And I think we've transitioned to more embracing of a biopsychosocial model, but I still think there's a lot of resonance still in the way we think and train people, which is around an acute care model. And yet the burgeoning burden of disease is all about persistent conditions. It's all about chronic conditions, and they come with multimorbidity, they come with complexity, they come with disability. And I think we're still evolving. How do we train physios to engage with that well, recognizing it's not the only thing they do, but it can be and it will become a substantial part of what we do.
I think that's an interesting perspective. And Peter, you made me remember the hours I spent remembering parameters for the electrotherapy. I even bought a book about that.
Imagine if you could ditch that. I can remember in my undergraduate training, it was the only subject that I nearly failed. And I can remember the electrotherapy lecturer coming out and going, I don't understand how you are topping every subject, but you nearly failed this one. It's because I said it's because it's bullshit. I just can't bring myself to learn this stuff. It just doesn't make sense.
I even bought a book to try to make sense in my mind.
So I think we often see it as something extra. We should just replace.
That's true. And still about the implementation part of CFT, do you think telehealth is an option? Did you have an experience with that during the pandemic or after, or now you're developing something?
That's a really good question. So personally, as a clinician, when we went to telehealth, I just rolled my entire caseload onto telehealth, and it was completely, you know, all the patients are like, yeah, no worries. Of course. Why wouldn't you? Where I know manual therapists were screwed because they're like, the patients going, well, why would I do telehealth? Because you can't push me. You can't manipulate me. And so telehealth's a perfect, Peter can talk about that from the trial perspective. But as a clinician, I'm still working with patients via telehealth. But in saying that, when we transition back to face-to-face, invariably people wanted to come in. We are social animals, and human beings desire social connectivity. So we see telehealth as a really wonderful opportunity for supporting people in maybe rural and remote areas who can't access care. But there may be times when it's more convenient for the patient just because of location and traffic problems or whatever. But invariably we see people seeking the face-to-face because I think we're social creatures and we love social interaction.
Great.
Right.
Peter, you can talk more to the trial probably.
We were so fortunate. At the time, I was the executive lead research or director of research in our department, and we had just enormous problems, like every university in the world, with trying to restructure trials that were running that were intensely interactive with people, and particularly vulnerable populations, in our case, Aboriginal populations, elderly, people with disabilities, etc. Many of those trials just hit the wall. But in Restore, we were able to just transition to not doing initial consultations for a period and then roll through, and the trial kept going. We were incredibly fortunate.
But we did have a little bit of telehealth, but not much, right?
We did, yeah, for follow-up consultations. Yeah.
Okay.
That's great. And Pete, as you have done research on kids as well, do you have any thoughts about CFT for this type of population? Like, is it the case for thinking on something like that?
It makes complete sense. Look at, in my practice, and to be fair, we included the inclusion criteria for this trial was really broad. We didn't include, it was 18 up. So we didn't have a top level, and we explicitly wanted to include people who weren't included in previous trials. So people post-surgery, elderly,
comorbidities,
comorbid health problems, mental health
challenges.
Exactly. Yeah. We really wanted a broad inclusion criteria because a lot of historical trials exclude all these people we know are the people who are the greatest burden. In saying that, I work a lot with young people, and we know from our epidemiological research that this is a burden that often emerges in adolescence. Yeah. So we see this as absolutely applicable to that group.
Great. Any plans for testing that?
So many plans.
Great.
I think you should bring that to Steve together.
So many plans. And look, it just makes sense. I personally love kids. I like it. I had a little girl, she's 12, came in, hurt her knee, was non-weight bearing, terrified, freaking out. Like, just working with kids is so much fun. They're so amenable to change. Yeah. But you have to work in family, so it's a little bit different because you're not just working with an individual now. You're working with a whole family context.
Family approach.
What we know is that often the child's behaviors reflect the beliefs and behaviors of the parent. Yeah. And so the social context is complex. And
the other way around, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So often you're having to intervene with the parent, to intervene with the child. Yeah. So, but it's a really cool space. Yeah.
Great. Good to know. Well, as you both know, this podcast is linked with the Pedro database. And so I'd like to also touch on the importance of evidence-based practice in chronic pain, or specifically low back pain, if you want. How do you see the management of back pain today? Do you think like this message from the Restore trial came to stay and possibly be part of the physio training, for example, for the future?
Yeah, I think my sense is, if you're probably familiar with the clinical care standard, that low back pain clinical care standard that came out this, like in September last year. Yeah. If you look at it, that's for the acute management, acute presentations. And a lot of acute presentations are chronic pain with an acute exacerbation. But fundamentally it says screen for red flags, do a thorough interview and examination, screen for psychosocial barriers to recovery, educate your patients, promote self-management, target the physical and psychological barriers to recovery, don't over-investigate unnecessarily and frighten people, don't throw too many dangerous drugs at people, make sure that you appropriately refer on if the person isn't responding. That ticks every box of what we see as good care. That really reflects the care we delivered in CFT. So in my mind, that kind of framework should be embedded in every basic training program, because it is where the evidence is at now. And then developing skills around that framework. So we would see at a basic, I'd say undergraduate level, that developing having a framework and then building on that framework makes complete sense, so that when the clinician comes out of their training, and this is one of the difficult points we know, is that often they come out of the university and then they're thrown into a private practice when they're taught to do dry needling and manual therapy. And there's this business demand that they bring the patients back. And so self-management is bad for business, but it's good for health. So we've got all these kind of pressure points, I think. So one is a training problem, one is a system problem. And the system problem is still, paying physios to do short consults. And then you've got, if you're in a private business, you're really rewarded by bringing people back and doing passive treatment. So we got all these tensions, I think, which push back against good care. That's a really tough space. So, we think you need multi-system change for this, where one, we provide frameworks and skills at a basic level. At a postgraduate level, you build on those skills to do the kind of training we think, we delivered in Restore. But also we need system change. We need funders to go, we're going to fund you differently. We're going to spend more, because we spent more time treating people in this trial than would typically occur in Australia, but it pays off. And that's the shift that I think we need, because we should be rewarded for spending more time delivering a different kind of care than short time delivering multiple bouts of care. That's the landscape I think we're stuck in.
And I think also further to the principles of, the good practice guidelines, I think we will see shifts in undergraduate and postgraduate curricula. And I think it's important to acknowledge CFT is an approach which is aligned with those guidelines, but we're seeing other approaches also emerge in physiotherapy that will come at it from a different angle, but will still address the same sorts of principles. And over time, we'll see evolutions of approaches which are engaging with chronic conditions or complex conditions in new ways. And that's as it should be.
Right.
Yeah, and often I think we see these kind of silos, like the manual therapy. Like, we're not anti-manual therapy; we are manual therapists as training. But I think where I see concern is and I see the worst cases, I have to say, in my practice, of people who have had literally years of passive treatment and they're distressed and disabled. Like, that's just not okay.
Yeah.
Like, that's not okay. And so we hear people going, oh, well, this is good as a manual therapy. And go, well, look, if you do manual therapy, that's totally okay, because we know it can provide a short-term pain relief. It may reassure people to get back to going. That's cool. Like, but we need to be better at identifying the people who we know become disabled, because they often drop out of manual therapy. Like, it's like they don't come back to us because they haven't been helped. So we often get this view of everyone we see benefits from our care. We know they don't. So we have to be targeting the people who are at greatest risk and putting our energy into that. And that's where those endeavors like the Start Back trial, I think, are really helpful, to say we need to identify the people at greatest risk and prioritize care to them, and not overtreat people who don't need a lot of care.
Yeah, sure. That's great. Yeah, so we'd like to thank you both so much for taking your time to talk to us today. And I think just our last question, as usual, if you could go back in time and talk to the Peter, which is both of you in the past, the Peters, what advice would you give him? This could be at the uni or beginning of career, or even beginning of all this study around CFT.
Well, I'll go first. My advice to a younger Pete or PK would be follow your heart. There are so many directions you can be sort of guided in or mentored in. And I think for both Pete and I don't say this because I think everyone should do this, but I think it's a hallmark of our careers is we've really followed our passion, we've followed our heart, and we've been true to what do I think should be investigated, what do I think I should put my energy in, even if it means that that's not what's best in the short term for our career, but it's what we believe should be done. And as I said, I'm at now the end of my career, certainly from an academic perspective. And when I look back at it, I just think that was so wonderful that somehow the world supported me when I made decisions that looked tough and looked like they were career limiting, but in fact things opened up and they were better than I imagined they would be.
Right.
Yeah, I suppose for me, like probably the first thing I would say is there were so many crossroads in my career where I nearly dropped out of physiotherapy, and I'm so grateful I didn't. It's I feel my job is so privileged. I've been so privileged to have amazing mentors around me, and to have people who have kind of nudged me and questioned me, and confronted my own beliefs and challenged my beliefs, and done it in a kind way. And then, to have a team around me that we have similar values. And I think it's for a young physiotherapist, we hear a lot of people, feeling like, oh my God, I don't want to do this job. It's not what I thought I think, we need to know what the possibilities are. So we've all been on a journey, and our journey will continue as long as I stay in the job. But, find kind mentors who have skills you don't have, who are willing to share that and build you up. I think we need to be better at that. I think we see so much in social media as tearing down of this group against this group, and there's nothing. Honestly, I see these things like nothing we really do makes a difference, so just do whatever you want. I don't think that's respectful for patients. I think if you look from the patient perspective, I think we forget the patient perspective to say, what are they asking for? What are the patients asking for? We need to think from their lens, in my mind. And so patient-centered care gives us that opportunity to see the world from their lens and not from our lens, to say, how can we take people on a journey? Because we have, as you rightly highlighted, that, the latest burden of disease, this is going to get worse. Low back pain is the number one cause of disability. It is going to get worse. We have to have a workforce that has better skills to equip to be better equipped to deal with that. And so, I would hope that new graduates would come out with a great sense of excitement, of possibility, of developing a broad skill set that is deeply rewarding to help people on a journey with a really tough health problem. And this is not just back pain, this is musculoskeletal pain and chronic diseases more broadly. That would be what I would say.
Awesome.
Amazing.
All right. Thank you both for the great conversation. And thank you for listening or watching. And if you like this episode, please share. And we see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.